feel free to correct me. His family was actually in the lithographic business from 1830 to 1880. That sounds about right, okay. And you're saying lithograph? What is that? If you know a little Greek, well, you're probably a show-off if you want to do that, but if you know a little Greek, you know that litho has something to do with stone. And if you look on this table over here, you are going to see, as you already have looked, you've seen some beautiful, beautiful pictures. And to think that people can take a flat stone or a metal plate of zinc or something else, aluminum, and using greasy pencils and water and oily things are able to produce that incredible beauty over there. If I remember correctly, photography kind of came into play in the national level somewhere around 1839 or something like that. But these lithographs actually go back before that. According to something I consulted, they go back to about 1796. And so somebody figuring out with simple principles that oil and water don't mix are able to make the right moves to put this all together. And Dave's going to tell us that. So here, what I like about lithographs is that you look at them and you see the raw beauty of these things, but it's like suddenly you're linked to some part way back in the past. You're seeing a picture of things and people and events that maybe you never thought you were going to see. Dave, tell us all about it. Dave Kellogg.
Thank you, Chuck. Actually, I can sit down now. He's given most of my presentation. And Sandy, thank you. And thank you all for coming here. (1830 to 1874). I don't need to correct Chuck. Well, the first question is, how many of you have heard of the Kellogg lithographers? Okay, we have one. How many of you have heard of Currier and Ives? Right. Well, actually, the Kellogg's worked out of Hartford, Connecticut. And they started the lithography business a few years before Currier. I don't want to say anything against Currier and Ives because their work is fantastic. And they were much larger and they produced many different prints. The Connecticut Historical Society has a collection, the world's largest collection of Kellogg prints, and it numbers over 1,000. So the Kellogg's were a presence at one time. And I should hasten to add that I have inherited none of their artistic talent, none of their business acumen, but I have inherited their name and some of these prints. Lithography began in this country in about 1820. It provided an inexpensive way of producing artwork to people who had never had the opportunity to put art in their homes. The Kellogg firm entered this business just as lithography was becoming wildly popular. So they were lucky and they were well positioned to have a good business. To give you an idea of the extent of lithography, they sold more than 100,000 prints of the same design. It happened to be a picture of George Washington. And they had many, many, many different designs. At that time, prints sold for 6 cents, uncolored, and 10 cents if they were colored. They had a very wide customer base, as evidenced by some letters in the Connecticut Historical Society that describe an order for 600 different prints going to North Carolina in 1833. They were successful businessmen for 44 years. Then they retired. They had a bewildering array of business arrangements, and that, coupled with a number of address changes, enables us to date their prints, often to a specific year. This is not possible with other lithographers. You'll see the date published on each of these slides. Now, because they were successful, it's obvious that they knew what the public wanted, they knew what images to produce. And because we know the dates of publication, we can use their prints as a portal through which we can view contemporary 19th century life. And my objective is to describe each print as they would have been received when they were published. How is the sound coming across? Because it's a little staticky from my ears.
Yeah.
Is it working all right?
Hold it down maybe just a little bit. Yeah, try that.
Okay.
When you got it down, your lips stay close to it.
Okay. Let's take a closer look at this one. First of all, you can see on the left when it was issued. It's a Revolutionary War print, but it was issued quite a few years after the Revolutionary War, so that tells us what the public wanted to see. And what we see is basically a family going to war. The father is reaching for his rifle, a grandfather is handing it to him, inspecting something at the operating end. He's also reaching for a sword that a grandmother is holding. His daughter is helping him adjust his uniform. His son looks to be doling out powder or shot. And his wife is holding an infant in her arms, but also a newspaper which says Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. And the women are turning to greet a fellow soldier coming in from the outside. And while all this is going on, there's a little kitten over here getting into mischief. So we ought to talk a little bit about the lithography process. And Chuck has already given a good explanation. Lithography is drawing on stone. So all these prints you see started with a stone. And it sounds a little tricky how anyone can get a good, distinct image from a stone. The limestone had to be imported from Germany because that was the only place where the fine-grained quality was available. And if you can imagine stones anywhere between 1 square foot and 2 square feet, they were pretty heavy. So a boatload of stones coming from Germany to Boston and then Connecticut would have been quite a journey. The surface had to be very smooth and flat, which is this first stage. And the drawing was done with a grease pencil or a crayon. And get this, which formed a hydrophobic molecular film tightly bonded to the stone. That's a lot of chemical things saying that you couldn't erase it once it was on. You had to use some carborundum and grind the stone down. This layer accepted ink but repelled water. Then the stone was washed with an aqueous solution to create a hydrophilic, that's the water-loving layer. The solution penetrated the pores in the limestone, and these areas repelled the printing ink. We go to the next stage. The printer had to keep the stone wet, but then he rolled printer's ink. That's not the aqueous stuff you might have in an inkwell at home. It's a greasy ink. Over the stone surface, the wet areas repelled this greasy ink, and the drawn lines and areas accepted it. Then it's just a matter of putting paper over the stone and applying a little bit of pressure, and you end up with a black and white drawing. Finally, color was added by hand in an assembly line process, one person per color. And the Kellogg brothers employed up to 100 women coloring their lithographs. The discovery of this combination of hydrophobic and hydrophilic steps was considered a great innovation in its time. Now, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know and speak up, because I know my voice is going to need periodic rests.
Could you get multiple impressions, like when you ink the stone, and could you do multiple impressions? Or would you have to keep re-inking there?
I suspect that you could get multiple, but how many I don't know. Just as you don't have to ink a newspaper press after each paper, you probably had enough ink for several different images. Does this mean anything to anyone? Barbara?
Did you draw a positive image, or did you draw a reverse image on a stone?
Well, the image would end up being reversed
You know, you have to draw a reverse image.
than what you want. Right. And that becomes particularly difficult when you have a lot of printing. We'll see a lot of printing on some of these slides. Okay, remember this. You might be wondering where lithographers got their subject matter, and the answer is they copied. In this case, from an oil painting. And it's quite a close resemblance. Now, Byron is, of course, George Gordon Lord Byron, the famous British romantic poet. He died a young man in 1824, and this print was made about 14 years after his death. Now, for those of you good in mathematics, you'll see that this is different, 1846 and 1824. This print was so popular when it first came out that they came out with a second edition 8 years later. So this is the second edition. Byron's letters were published several years after his death, and they attracted the attention of a public fascinated with his amorous adventures. That quote, remember it? Mad, bad, and dangerous to know. That was how Lady Caroline Lamb described Byron. She was one of a succession of his lovers. But then what could you expect from a fellow whose father was called Captain Mad Jack Byron? His grandfather was Admiral Foul Weather Byron, and his great uncle was known as simply Wicked Lord Byron. At the bottom of both the painting and the print are these lines. My dear Tom, I cannot really go on. There is a pair of great black eyes looking over my shoulder, so that I must turn and answer them instead of you. Well, that's taken right from one of his letters. Mariana Sagatti was his landlord's wife when Byron was living in Venice. But that did not stop them from a passionate love affair which became known through all his letters. Byron wrote several friends about her large, black, oriental eyes and his infatuation with them. That's what the public wanted to see in 1846. Byron first fell in love at age 15 and adamantly refused to return to his boarding school. That prompted his mother to write, "He has no illness that I know of but love. Desperate love, the worst of all maladies. In short, the boy is distractedly in love with Miss Chaworth." Byron was irresponsible and to an extreme and impetuous, but he was always entertaining. Once while on a ship awaiting entry to Constantinople, he grew bored, jumped overboard, and swam across the Hellespont, a distance of about 3 miles. He thus became the first known person to swim from Europe to Asia. His inspiration was the ancient Greek myth about Leander, who swam the Hellespont every night to visit his lover. Now, Byron's feat has in turn inspired an annual open water swim held every August 30th. Our new ambassador to Japan, Carolyn Kennedy, and her 2 daughters have swum in this race. If this catches your fascination, swimming from Europe to Asia, registration is still open for this event this year. Byron was described by his biographer as handsome, finely proportioned, and with a graceful appearance. Genius was in his eyes and lips. Nature could do little more for him, with one exception. He was born with a club foot, an affliction of which he was terribly self-conscious. It helped make him skeptical, cynical, and sometimes savage. He ranged through life, leaving tragedy and hurt in his wake. Sounds like some of the Hollywood bad boys of today. This doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. You can see your home state and read why it was prepared. The Kellogg's were experienced map makers and were awarded a contract by the New York State government. And this map shows the population of towns, wards, and counties for the purpose of apportionment. You might be interested in zooming into Fabius to see what the population was. I don't know if that number agrees with what your records show.
Is that map available anywhere, you know? Or copies of it?
I suspect few copies were made because they were just distributed to the legislature. There are dealers in ancient maps and in Kellogg prints. Big
I
pardon?
buy from them all the time.
Ah,
I just haven't ever seen this one.
this is not one that I have. This comes from Connecticut. Barbara Rivette is here. You might be interested in knowing the population of Manlius. It was 5,602. And for Senator Hoffman, New York State was 2,604,495. If you exclude aliens, paupers, and persons of color not taxed, it drops to 2,400,000. So I guess that was the way they took the census. Here's a completely different subject. The background here is that Philip, Philip II, we see back here, the king of Macedon and Alexander's father, was a great horseman. He actually won a horse race at the Olympic Games in 354 BC. But neither he nor his fellow horsemen could tame this horse, Bucephalus. Bucephalus was afraid of his own shadow, and when someone leapt on his back, and that shadow included the rider, he just went ballistic, and no one could stay on him. Alexander was about 13 years old at this time, and he was very perceptive. He noticed this, so he led the horse into the sun with the shadow behind him. Leapt on the horse, and as long as he could guide the horse into the sun, he stayed on, thus prompting his father's comment. 1852 or so, we have to wonder how many of the Kellogg customers read the ancient classics and understood this print. It's not a very great picture of a ship. I don't know where they got the image, but They probably copied it from perhaps a photograph, a wire photograph or something. But in 1858, the launching date of this ship, it was by far the largest ship ever built. She could carry 4,000 passengers around the world without stopping, although she never did. She was a combination, as you can see, sailing and steamship, built of iron with a double hull, had 6 masts, 2 paddle wheels, and a propeller 24 feet in diameter. I don't know how high the ceiling is, but that would give us an idea. After several accidents, she stopped carrying passengers and was outfitted to lay telegraph cable. And this is actually the first, the ship that laid the permanent transatlantic cable. She went on to lay about 30,000 miles of cable, including one from England to India. Recently, she was listed with 6 other technological achievements as the greatest 7 in the world. Who hears of her today? Her 30-year career did not end gracefully. She ended up as a floating concert hall, then a floating gymnasium, and a floating advertisement for a department store. And then she was broken up for scrap. But on the bright side, her topmast survives to this day as a flagpole for the Liverpool Football Club in England. The Navy has had some very interesting reports, these being 4 of them. The bottom 2 that are in blue are the subject of the next 2 lithographs, and they're from the War of 1812. This is the 200th anniversary of that war. The Civil War is an anniversary, and I also snuck in the Revolutionary War and the Mexican War. The British ship Macedonian was recognized as the most important prize ever taken by the U.S. Navy, and that statement stands to this day. It sounds a little strange to me, and if you're doubting it, I can only point you to a book written 10 years ago which made that statement. If you read it in print, it must be true. The Macedonian and 2 sister ships were commissioned to fight against Napoleon, but soon found themselves in the War of 1812. After her capture, the U.S. refitted her but kept her name. She was used primarily for gunboat diplomacy for nearly 110 years. Her last years were spent as a seaside hotel in the Bronx. And she met her in the hotel, caught fire and burned. It was the same day that Babe Ruth hit his 5th home run in 1922. This is really hard to decipher. This is Oliver Perry's victory. And the 200th anniversary is coming up next month. The U.S. Mint has issued an order to commemorate this. Perry started on this ship, the Lawrence, named after Captain Lawrence, the author of one of those quotes, "Don't give up the ship." But there is a mix-up in the orders, and the British concentrated their fire on Perry's ship. And you can see the cannonballs and holes in her sails. Perry had to leave the ship and row under strong fire to the Niagara. The Niagara we see in the center. I was going to say with the American flag, but it's a little hard to make that out. After some skirmishing, Perry sailed to Niagara through the middle of the British fleet, giving them broadsides as he went. And that's how Perry beat the world's greatest navy. His famous message to Major General William Henry Harrison, who later became president, was, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." An entirely different subject here. One of Hartford's most famous residents was Harriet Beecher Stowe. Both she and her sister, Catherine Beecher, advised homemakers about the cultural value of decorating with lithographs. In their book, The American Woman's Home, Catherine Beecher recommended decorating with lithographs for economy, color, and instruction. I'll read from a description by the director of the Connecticut Historical Society. She writes that this print functions as a how to decorate pictograph. The table settings are refined. There's a large bookcase in the center, a shelf clock on the mantle. Keeps time because time management was a wifely duty. And a steaming little teapot positively sings its approval of this snug, well-managed family moment. The Hartford Female Seminary was founded by Catherine Beecher in 1823. It was one of the first major educational institutions for women in the United States. In 3 years, it had enrolled nearly 100 students and implemented radical programs such as physical education courses for women. The Kellogg firm provided their diplomas, or as they are called here, testimonials to scholarship and deportment. We're very pleased to have a descendant of the Beecher family with us this evening, whose name is Beecher Graham. You want to wave, Beecher? When I mention that Beecher and I have a past, this is what I'm referring to. Who can tell us who said this? Nathan Hale. These are illustrations from the book. Kellogg's made lithographs for inclusion in the book from 1856. Everyone liked Nathan Hale. At every stage of his short life, young and old, male and female, he excelled in every aspect of life. He entered Yale at 16 and graduated in 3 years. He enlisted in the Revolutionary Army shortly after the Lexington Alarm in 1775. Within a year, he had attracted the attention of General Washington. It was Washington who asked Hale to ascertain the numbers and location of British soldiers in New York City so he could mount an effective defense. Hale knew what he was getting into and bravely took the risk. He was captured on the last day of his 2-week reconnaissance. He was treated with brutality. There was no trial. He was taken to General Howe and then scheduled to be hung the next morning. He was denied his Bible and writing materials. And when he stood up with the rope around his neck and spoke his famous line, witnesses said there was more to follow, but the British provost interrupted him by shouting, "Swing the rebel away." He was buried in an unmarked grave. Since he was from Connecticut, you might expect that this print, or this book, would have had a big following. These are 2 of 8 illustrations. Today, nearly everyone recognizes the name Benedict Arnold. In fact, the name has become synonymous for a traitor. But John Andre seems to have been lost to history, at least in this country. General Arnold was the commandant of West Point when he decided to sell the plans of the fort to the British. Major Andre was his contact. Andre traveled up the Hudson, received the plans from Arnold near West Point, but on his return, he was stopped by the local militia. This print, published 2 generations after the event, celebrates the alertness of Andre's 3 captors, Paulding, Van Wart, and Williams. Fortunately, one of the 3 knew how to read. They found the plans to West Point in either around his stocking or in his boot, and that's what the print illustrates. Andre the spy was tried and sentenced to hanging. In the interim, he was treated with the utmost respect. He was comfortably housed and fed and surrounded by sympathy and attention. He had the opportunity to write letters, including an unsuccessful plea to General Washington. When the day came, he was buried respectfully. Eventually, his remains were requested by the British and transferred to Westminster Abbey, the Heroes and Poets section. Now we go to the Mexican-American War, sometimes called President Polk's War, and it occurred at a very interesting time. American lithography had reached its maturity, but it was before technology allowed the inclusion of lithographs in newspapers. As a consequence, the public was clamoring not only for written news, but also images of the war. The Kellogg's produced a whopping 38 known lithographs which showed the reality of war, helped popularize heroes, and may actually have played a role in catapulting General Zachary Taylor to the presidency. So who was Major Ringgold? He was the son of a Maryland congressman. He was a member of the first graduating class at West Point in 1918. His military inventions caused him to be called the father of modern artillery. Well, of course, modern in 1846. Ringgold introduced the tactical concept of flying artillery. He never left the ground, but flying meaning it could be moved very rapidly instead of positioned and kept for the duration of the battle. 5 days before the war actually was declared, General Taylor was surprised and attacked by a vastly superior force at Palo Alto, Texas. He called on Ringgold to counter with his artillery. The rapid movement of U.S. artillery was successful and won the battle. Unfortunately, Major Ringgold was mortally wounded, and if you're not too queasy, you can see a cannonball that entered his right thigh and continued on going. His reputation was such that his death inspired songs, poetry, and plays, and this Kellogg print. Zachary Taylor was known for his coolness under fire. This was another battle where the Americans were outnumbered by the Mexican forces, this time nearly 4-1. At one point, in the heat of battle, Artillery Captain Bragg came rushing up to Taylor, a little frantically, saying that he could not halt the advancing Mexican forces. Taylor's calm response stated here, instructed Bragg to load his cannon with more grape shot. A double portion worked, and Bragg was able to control the enemy's advance. Taylor's response, abbreviated to "give them more grape," became one of his slogans when he ran for the presidency. Bragg's name lives on as Fort Bragg in North Carolina. This is the same battle I was describing, but this dramatic print addresses the death of George Lincoln, another well-known soldier. He was the son of a Massachusetts governor and U.S. congressman. They were distantly related to Abraham Lincoln. 1 year after his death, depicted here, Abraham Lincoln stayed with the Massachusetts Lincolns while campaigning for Zachary Taylor for president. No doubt about it, the Courier Red Riding Hood is cuter, isn't she?
Yeah.
But the print is also in a better state of preservation. And this is an example where Courier was copying from Kellogg. In 1863, life was tough. Children had to be prepared to handle difficult situations, sometimes tragic situations. Both Reds have a determined look, but the Kellogg Red looks a little tougher. If you visit Hartford, Connecticut, and tour the Mark Twain home, you'll see the Kellogg print on the wall in his nursery. He's high up. If you look at it. You wouldn't recognize it unless you were a Kellogg, actually.
Dave, are there artists' credits for any of the original drawings, and which ones do you know are original drawings or which ones came from some other image?
We can clearly, thank you. We can clearly see a difference in the artistic rendering. The first Kellogg brother to start the business was really a talented artist, and some of his work is on the table over there. There were two, and two of his brothers were very good artists, but they were more businessmen. There were a couple of other Connecticut artists who worked for them, but that's all that's known, and presumably as they were churning out these different prints, there must have been several artists. That early one of Byron and Mariana looked a little flat to me. So I suspect that was, they were in a hurry to get that one out because of the interesting subject matter behind it.
You mentioned earlier that the drawing was done with a grease pencil of some sort.
Yes.
I noticed how fine the work is. How do you get a grease pencil that fine?
That's a great question to bring up, and I'm not going to be able to answer it, but that's part of the mystery. And sometimes they're referred to as a grease pencil. And there's an example of really fine drawing on the table, and I have a slide of one that's equally fine. How they did it, I just don't know. John James Audubon had a way of describing nature in social terms. And I'll bet you think the next slide is of John James Audubon. Well, you'd be half right. And this is not a copy, but if you ever watch the Antiques Roadshow, there's a fellow from the Philadelphia print shop who describes lithographs. And this is his description of this print. The print of a young boy holding a rifle alludes to John James Audubon. How would you know that? The famous naturalist. A number of Audubon portraits, such as the one to the right, appeared during this decade to promote sales of his books, for example, Birds of America, which was published in 1840. The Little Sportsman's Long Hair, the Flintlock Rifle, the Dog, and the Bird Trophy to the right all echo elements of the adult Audubon portrait. In an age when men were hunting for sport as well as sustenance, the message was to let your boy be a hunter so he too could become an author scientist. Audubon died in *51, the same year this print was made. So it makes us wonder if his death didn't have a reaction from the public and that Kellogg saw a market in composing this image. We've worked our way to the Civil War. And this is what's called a political cartoon. And when you're able to look at it closely, it becomes quite pointed. Three cats are fighting over a liberty cat, which has the shape of a boat, which is on an American flag. The white cat inside wears a collar which reads, "Aid." He struggles to keep the boat steady. The other white cat has a collar reading "Jeff," with a rope around his neck, and he's trying to upset it. The black cat, glaring at Jeff, wears a ribbon reading "Contraband." And in the background, there's a medicine bottle with a label that reads "Lincoln Blackstrap," which is the molasses. Directions: one dose immediately, another on January 1st, 1863, prepared by the Union Company, Horace Greeley, agent. Of course, that date, January 1st, is the date of the Emancipation Proclamation. So in this case, because of the labeling on the bottle, one dose immediately, that's sometime before the Emancipation Proclamation, and I believe Lincoln publicized it in October, so we can date the print to a 2 or 3 month period. In the left foreground, there are 3 dice showing 3 sixes. At the lower right, 3 dice with 2 1s and a 3. I see a quizzical expression. No one in our era has been able to explain the significance of the numbers on the dice. So there's room for research. I tried to count states, I tried to count representatives, it made no sense to me.
I don't know how many there
General McClellan was always immensely popular with his men, and this image was made early in the Civil War when he was still in favor with President Lincoln. And Lincoln eventually promoted him to General-in-Chief of all the federal armies. George was known as a great organizer and built esprit de corps in his troops. However, he proved to be very cautious and was slow to take offensive action. Lincoln had to remove him from all command. Very heroic, general-like image. The next print illustrates the reason for Lincoln's decision. McClellan's strategy was to bring his army south in the Chesapeake Bay and land them below Richmond, Virginia, then work his way north and west to capture the city. Williamsburg stood in the way. As the battle unfolded, General Hancock found himself in an advantageous position and ignored 2 orders to withdraw. His gallant charge drove the Confederate troops back and relieved the pressure put on Union forces. Despite his success, his commanders, including McClellan, did not exploit the situation. Some say this was McClellan's first victory of the war. He called it a superb victory, which gave rise to the nickname Hancock the Superb. The Confederates also called it a victory because it gave them time to retreat and fortify Richmond, which they held for another 2 years. Probably didn't expect this. This is the moment. You can see the powder exploding from Booth's gun. Mary Lincoln is the only one reacting at this point. And if we compare this print to Doris Kearns Goodwin and her description of this moment taken from testimonies in her book, Team of Rivals, we see it's quite accurate, with one exception. Perhaps in the Kellogg's haste to get this out in the market, they mistook Major Rathbone's name as Major Rathbun. Clara Harris was the daughter of Mary Lincoln's friend, Senator Ira Harris from New York. He had succeeded William H. Seward when Seward became the Secretary of State. Rathbone and Miss Harris had recently become engaged, but Rathbone became another victim that fateful night when he was stabbed trying to apprehend Booth. Well, we're getting close here. 2 more images. And this is one of those where you might wonder how in the world they could draw with such detail on a stone. At first glance, we see an extremely well-executed portrait of an elegantly dressed man. Then we discover he's a janitor. He appears with the accoutrements of his trade. A rope for ringing a bell, 2 keys, a gold chain presumably attached to a watch, a broom in the crook of his arm, and then a bucket. James Williams served in the War of 1812, and he was Trinity's first janitor, starting when the college was founded in Hartford in 1823. He remained for about 50 years, and it is said that he was beloved by all who encountered him. But why call him Professor Jim? Maybe he was very well spoken, but for sure, we know that he gave a commencement address each year. Janitor or professor giving a commencement address. He was the subject of an 1880s Harper's Illustrated article and a 1973 book. 1973 would have been 150 years after he started. This print would have been 25 years after he started work, so maybe it was part of a celebration. Shall I please him? Sounds a little racy in today's climate. What it really means is, will my dress and presentation please him? It was a woman's role to please her husband by appearance rather than by scholarly attributes. Women were the jewels in a man's crown. 1830 to 1836 is pretty early. And frankly, this print didn't appeal to me very much because her head looks a little awkward. I thought maybe one artist drew the body and another artist came in and drew the head. Frankly, I didn't appreciate her clothes, but I'm sure some of you will. I did like the idea of this tall mirror lit by candles. But then I read a book by Yves Laplante called Marmee and Louisa. Has anyone heard of that? You're missing something. It's a double biography of Louisa May Alcott and her mother, Abigail May. Now that name May should ring a bell because Abigail was Samuel Joseph May's sister. And Both Abigail and Louisa May Alcott spent time here in Syracuse, while Samuel was the clergyman for the May Memorial Church. Abigail grew up wishing she could go to school like her brother. She struggled all her life to assert herself as an equal in a man's world, all the while carrying her family of 5 on her shoulders. In 1848, she complained in her journal, "Women are taught to employ costume and innocence, and that beauty should be the foundation of a woman's character." And although she didn't say it, it's obviously she did not like that. It's thanks to Abigail, who encouraged her daughter Louisa to write every day in her journal, and Louisa's success, she became the most successful author of her day, both in sales and financial reward. And it is due as much to her talent as it is to Abigail's schooling. That's the last slide. So if you have questions or comments, this would be a good time for them.
What got you started on this, Dave?
Actually, a relative died some decades ago in Connecticut, and when my parents were going through, we lived in New Jersey, going through his belongings, they found a box, and in the box were some of these early Kellogg prints. And my parents had them for a while. They framed one, which was put in our living room, and the others just stayed in the box. When my mother passed away, my sister and my brother divided up what was in there, and I really got interested. About 5 years ago, maybe less, the Connecticut Historical Society mounted an exhibit of Kellogg prints, and it was terrific. And they also published a book with more than 1,000 prints illustrated. Besides that, I have the collector's gene. I can't help it.
How do they colorize it? Is that watercolor? Because it looks too crisp.
It is watercolor, and perhaps mixed with a little gum arabic. And yes, I can see you're viewing this and admiring the color. You'll see color over there that looks even a little brighter.
Like crisp, I'm reading the lines of it. It doesn't blend one into the other, but there's a separation from the pink to the green. It's very nice and crisp.
In these early prints, they seem to take more time. Later on, when they were churning out hundreds or thousands of prints, they had to work faster. That's my interpretation. I just wasn't there at the time.
So they were all colored, all hand colored?
All hand colored.
I used to have a couple of litho stones that had been used in the print shop, I think maybe in the 1920s or 30s. But the image, whatever they were printing, were advertising cuts. They seem to be etched in the stone. Is there a different process later on, you know?
Because
They were still there. They weren't grease pencils. They were part of the little, you could feel it with your finger.
Well, remember that phrase, that chemical phrase? A hydrophobic molecular film?
I was wondering if it was maybe acid etching.
Not in these prints, but perhaps later on they found a way of doing that. At that time, they would have been doing something called chromolithography, a different process.
You know, once you said that they hired up to
100. 100 women.
Wasn't this unusual for women to be able to work outside the home? Or
It may have been, but the newspaper of Hartford, the Hartford Courant, still going strong, seemed to always have advertisement where women wanted to color prints.
When I was about 21, 50-some odd years ago, and I was in the Navy, I had a friend who was the chief lithographer on the ship. And all of the ship's operations orders, all of the maps, everything that was used to create plans was made in this litho shop. And I remember seeing some of the work. One of the things I saw were photographic negatives that were made big. And then those negatives were touched up. People would take, if there was an error in it, I mean not an error, but a white spot or a black spot, they'd fix that with a knife or putting something on the film. And then this film was then put onto a lithographic plate, which was a metallic plate. And that lithographic plate was then what was used to make the prints, which were then assembled into operation orders and what have you. So at some point, this became a photolithographic process.
It's the evolution, I suspect, of the early stone lithography. They just kept the name, changed the materials.
The plates were tiny, were quite thin.
Barbara?
I was just gonna say that it's hard for us to imagine a world we're so drenched in color, but these were the only color, you know, the wood color in the newspapers, and there wasn't any illustrations usually in newspapers. And these were really the only, aside from paintings, that anyone would have. And that's why Catherine Beecher put them on the wall for her house.
Anything else? Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed doing this.